You must become addicted to your appearance not out of vanity, but out of responsibility. The way you present yourself is not a surface matter. It is a psychological statement. Your appearance is the first boundary between your inner world and the outer reality. When it is neglected, something deeper has been abandoned. When it is honored, the psyche begins to organize itself. Most people misunderstand neglect as humility. They confuse self-erasure with virtue. But the unconscious does not respond to intentions. It responds to symbols. And your body, posture, clothing, grooming, and physical presence are powerful symbols. When you disregard them, the psyche receives a message, I am not worth care. Over time, this belief solidifies and leaks into every area of life: relationships, ambition, confidence, and purpose. To care deeply about your appearance is to practice daily self-recognition. It is to say without words, I exist and I matter. When you refine how you show up, you refine how you think. Discipline in the external world awakens order in the internal one. Chaos retreats when structure arrives, and appearance is one of the most immediate structures you can control. There is also a shadow to neglect. Often, refusing to look good is an unconscious rebellion against expectation, against visibility, against responsibility. To be seen is to be judged. To look powerful is to risk becoming accountable. So many hide in disorder because it feels safer than potential. But growth demands exposure. Transformation demands that you allow yourself to be visible. When you elevate your appearance, you integrate dignity into your identity. You begin to walk differently, speak differently, and choose differently. Others respond not because of aesthetics alone, but because coherence is felt. A person aligned within projects authority without effort. The outer form mirrors the inner state. Becoming addicted to your appearance means committing to self-respect as a daily ritual, not for approval, not for comparison, but for alignment. You are telling your nervous system, I am prepared to meet life fully, and life responds accordingly. This is not about perfection. It is about intention. It is about showing up as someone who has made peace with their existence and decided to honor it. When you dress, groom, and carry yourself with care, you are not decorating the self, you are integrating it. Your appearance is not a superficial choice. It is a psychological signal constantly transmitted to both the world and the unconscious. Before a word is spoken, before intention is clarified, the psyche has already made a declaration through posture, grooming, clothing, and the way the body occupies space. These signals operate beneath rational thought, shaping how others respond and, more importantly, how the individual experiences themselves. The mind does not exist separately from the body. It expresses itself through form. What is repeatedly expressed becomes identity. When appearance is treated carelessly, the unconscious interprets this as a withdrawal of value. The psyche learns through repetition, not logic. Each act of neglect quietly reinforces the belief that care is unnecessary or undeserved. Over time, this belief does not remain limited to aesthetics. It extends into boundaries, standards, and expectations. The person begins to tolerate what should be questioned, accept what should be challenged, and minimize what should be protected. What looks like indifference on the outside often masks an internal resignation. To attend to appearance is to engage in self-recognition. It is an embodied acknowledgement of existence. When someone chooses to look composed, intentional, and awake, the psyche registers coherence. Order is not merely a mental state, it is a lived structure. The body becomes a container capable of holding confidence, discipline, and presence. This is why small, consistent acts of care often produce disproportionate psychological effects. They stabilize the inner world by giving it visible form. Appearance also carries symbolic meaning. Humans respond to symbols instinctively, and the self is no exception. Clothing, grooming, and posture act as signals that inform the nervous system whether one is prepared or unprepared, worthy or uncertain, grounded or fragmented. When these signals are aligned with self-respect, the individual begins to inhabit their own life more fully. When they are ignored, the psyche remains in a state of quiet disorganization, searching for structure that never arrives. There is often resistance to this understanding because caring about appearance is misinterpreted as vanity, yet vanity seeks validation, while psychological alignment seeks integration. One depends on external approval, the other generates internal authority. When appearance is used as a tool of alignment, it no longer serves the ego as hunger, but the psyche as need for wholeness. The individual is no longer performing for others, but communicating with themselves. Avoidance of self-care frequently hides a deeper fear, the fear of visibility. To be seen is to be accountable. A refined appearance announces readiness, and readiness invites responsibility. For many, disorder feels safer than potential because it lowers expectation. But the psyche stagnates in safety. Growth requires the courage to present oneself clearly, even imperfectly. Over time, a respected appearance reshapes behavior. Movement becomes deliberate. Speech becomes measured. Choices become selective. This is not because clothing or grooming possess magical power, but because the psyche responds to what it repeatedly witnesses. When the self is treated as something valuable, it learns to act accordingly. Neglecting how you look does not remain a neutral act. It quietly educates the unconscious. The psyche learns less from what we claim to believe and more from what we repeatedly do. When appearance is consistently ignored, the unconscious receives a subtle but persistent message that care is unnecessary, excessive, or undeserved. This message does not stay confined to the surface. It seeps into identity, shaping how a person evaluates their own worth long before conscious thought intervenes. Unworthiness rarely announces itself directly. It forms through habits of self-abandonment that appear harmless on the surface. Skipping care, dismissing presentation, or allowing disorder to accumulate becomes a silent agreement with the idea that one's presence does not require intention. Over time, the psyche interprets this pattern as truth. If the self is not worthy of attention, then its needs, boundaries, and aspirations also lose priority. What begins as physical neglect slowly restructures psychological expectations. The unconscious is symbolic in nature. It interprets actions as meaning rather than circumstance. Each act of neglect becomes symbolic proof, reinforcing an inner narrative of insufficiency. The body, being the most immediate symbol of the self, becomes the primary medium through which this narrative is written. When it is treated carelessly, the unconscious internalizes that carelessness as identity. The individual does not merely look neglected. They begin to feel invisible within their own life. This process often develops defensively. Neglect can serve as a shield against disappointment or judgment. By lowering standards of presentation, the psyche attempts to lower the risk of rejection. If little effort is made, little is expected. Yet this protective mechanism slowly turns inward. The self becomes something to hide rather than inhabit. What feels like safety gradually transforms into self-erasure, reinforcing the very sense of unworthiness it was meant to avoid. Neglect also disrupts coherence between the inner and outer world. When inner desires for dignity, respect, or growth are not reflected externally, tension forms. The psyche experiences this as fragmentation. There's a growing gap between who one senses they could be and how they allow themselves to appear. This gap breeds quiet shame, not because of appearance itself, but because of the unspoken knowledge that something essential is being denied expression. As neglect continues, the nervous system adapts to diminished expectation. Posture collapses, energy retracts, and presence becomes tentative. These bodily signals further confirm the unconscious belief that the self should remain small. Social interactions subtly reinforce this belief as others respond to the signals being transmitted. The individual then mistakes these responses as external validation of internal worthlessness, completing a self-reinforcing cycle. Reversing this pattern does not require perfection or external approval. It requires interrupting the unconscious lesson being taught. When care is reintroduced, even in small ways, the psyche begins to receive a different message. Attention signals value, intention signals worth. Over time, these embodied signals rewrite the narrative the unconscious has been repeating. The self slowly becomes something to care for rather than avoid, not through affirmation, but through lived evidence. External discipline is not merely a strategy for productivity. It is a psychological architecture that brings order to the inner world. The psyche is shaped less by abstract intentions and more by visible patterns of behavior. When actions are consistent, structured, and intentional, the unconscious interprets this as stability. Chaos within often persists not because insight is lacking, but because form is absent. Discipline supplies that form. When the external world is left unstructured, the mind mirrors this disorder. Decisions become reactive, emotions fluctuate without containment, and self-perception weakens. The psyche requires predictable boundaries to organize itself. Simple acts of discipline, routine, care, preparation, and follow-through create a rhythm that signals reliability. Each repeated action becomes evidence that the self can be depended upon. Over time, this evidence accumulates into self-trust. Self-trust does not arise from positive thinking or reassurance. It emerges when the psyche observes congruence between intention and behavior. When you say you will do something and then do it, even in small ways, the unconscious registers integrity. External discipline becomes a form of inner dialogue where action answers doubt. The self begins to feel safe within its own promises, and safety is the foundation of order. Discipline also reduces psychological friction. Many internal conflicts arise from unresolved decisions and undefined standards. Without structure, the mind remains in a constant state of negotiation. External discipline resolves this by removing ambiguity. When routines are established, energy is no longer wasted debating whether or how to act. The psyche relaxes into clarity. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable because the path is already defined. There is often resistance to discipline because it is associated with restriction. Yet true discipline does not constrain the self, it protects it. It creates boundaries that prevent the psyche from being scattered by impulse or external pressure. Within these boundaries, freedom emerges. The mind gains space to explore, reflect, and create without being hijacked by chaos. Order does not limit potential, it concentrates it. As discipline strengthens, identity begins to stabilize. The individual no longer feels fragmented by mood or circumstance. Actions reflect values with increasing consistency. This alignment produces a quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation. The psyche learns that it can rely on itself to respond effectively to life. Trust deepens not because outcomes are always successful, but because effort remains intact regardless of outcome. External discipline also regulates emotional states. When actions remain steady, emotions follow more predictably. The nervous system responds to regularity with calm. Anxiety often arises not from difficulty, but from unpredictability. Discipline replaces uncertainty with structure, allowing emotional energy to be processed rather than suppressed or expressed chaotically. Over time, the inner world begins to reflect the order established outside. Thoughts become clear, reactions become measured, and self-perception becomes grounded. The individual no longer seeks motivation as a prerequisite for action. Action itself generates motivation through proof of capability. What once required force becomes natural. Through consistent external discipline, the psyche learns a vital lesson. It is not at the mercy of impulse or circumstance. It can shape reality through deliberate action. This realization quietly transforms self-doubt into self-trust and inner chaos into a stable, inhabitable inner landscape. Avoiding self-care is rarely about laziness or indifference. It often conceals a deeper psychological hesitation toward visibility and responsibility. To care for oneself is to prepare the self to be seen. It is an unconscious declaration of readiness, and readiness carries weight. When someone neglects their appearance, health, or daily maintenance, the psyche may be attempting to remain unnoticeable, protected from the demands that visibility invites. Visibility exposes the individual to judgment, expectation, and consequence. To be seen clearly is to be evaluated not only by others but by oneself. Self-care sharpens the outline of identity. It makes the self more defined, and definition brings accountability. Once the self appears intentional and capable, it becomes harder to deny one as potential. Avoidance, then, becomes a way to delay the moment when one must answer to what they could become. Responsibility is inseparable from presence. When someone presents themselves with care, they signal that they are available to engage with life. This engagement requires decisions, boundaries, and the willingness to endure discomfort. For many, neglect offers an unconscious refuge. By appearing unprepared or disengaged, expectations are lowered. The individual can remain psychologically hidden, shielded from both failure and success. What feels like freedom from pressure is often a withdrawal from agency. The psyche is sensitive to implication. When self-care is avoided, the unconscious interprets this not simply as neglect, but as retreat. The body becomes a place to disappear rather than to inhabit. Over time, this retreat reinforces the belief that safety lies in invisibility. The individual may rationalize this as humility or non-attachment, yet internally there is often tension. A part of the self senses that something essential is being withheld from expression. Avoiding self-care also fragments identity. There is an internal awareness of untapped capacity paired with an external presentation that contradicts it. This dissonance generates quiet anxiety. The psyche knows it is capable of more presence, more coherence, more engagement, yet the refusal to act keeps that knowledge unresolved. The resulting discomfort is not always conscious, but it manifests as restlessness, irritability, or a vague sense of stagnation. Responsibility becomes threatening when it is associated with permanence. To care for oneself consistently implies commitment. It suggests continuity of effort and the willingness to sustain standards over time. For those who fear being trapped by expectation, neglect offers a way to remain undefined. Undefined identities feel lighter because they carry fewer obligations, yet they also carry less meaning. The psyche struggles to anchor itself without form. Reintroducing self-care challenges this avoidance directly. Each act of care is a small confrontation with visibility. It tells the unconscious that the self is willing to occupy space, to be recognized, and to be held accountable for its presence. This can initially provoke discomfort because it dismantles the protective strategy of hiding, but within that discomfort lies growth. As self-care becomes consistent, responsibility begins to feel less threatening and more stabilizing. The self no longer needs to evade expectation because it develops confidence in its capacity to respond. Visibility transforms from a source of anxiety into a source of alignment. The individual is no longer managing life from concealment, but participating in it with intention. Elevating your appearance is not a cosmetic adjustment. It is a psychological reorganization that strengthens identity, posture, and confidence simultaneously. The psyche does not separate how you look from who you are. It experiences the body as an extension of identity, and when that extension is treated with intention, the sense of self becomes more defined. Appearance functions as a mirror through which the inner world recognizes itself. When that mirror reflects care, coherence begins to form. Identity stabilizes through repeated signals. Each deliberate choice in how you present yourself becomes a statement of self-recognition. Over time, these statements accumulate into a lived narrative. This is someone who takes themselves seriously. The unconscious absorbs this narrative not as affirmation, but as evidence. Identity becomes less fragile because it is reinforced daily through action. The self no longer feels abstract or uncertain, it feels embodied. Posture is one of the most immediate expressions of this shift. When appearance is elevated, the body naturally aligns. Shoulders settle, the spine lengthens, and movement becomes intentional. This is not a performance, but a physiological response. The nervous system interprets intentional presentation as readiness. The body adjusts to match that readiness, adopting a stance that reflects stability rather than defense. Posture changes first because the body responds faster than thought. Confidence emerges as a byproduct, not a goal. It arises from coherence between inner intention and outer expression. When the way you appear aligns with how you wish to engage with life, internal friction decreases. There is less need to compensate, explain, or hide. The psyche relaxes into congruence. Confidence, in this sense, is not bravado but ease. It is the absence of inner contradiction. Elevating appearance also alters how the individual moves through social space. Others respond to the signals being transmitted, but more importantly, the individual responds to themselves differently. When you see yourself showing up with care, the unconscious updates its expectations. You begin to trust your presence. This trust changes behavior, speech becomes measured, decisions become selective, and reactions become less reactive. The self feels grounded rather than performative. There is also a reclaiming of authority in this process. Neglect often diminishes self-perception, making the individual feel smaller or less legitimate. Care reverses this contraction. By refining appearance, the self claims space without aggression. Authority is projected not through dominance, but through clarity. People sense when someone is comfortable occupying their own form, and that comfort carries weight. Resistance to elevating appearance often stems from fear of being judged or misunderstood. Yet judgment occurs regardless. The difference lies in agency. When you choose how you present yourself, you participate in shaping the narrative rather than being passively defined by it. This participation reinforces identity because it affirms authorship over the self. Over time, the cumulative effect is subtle but profound. Identity becomes cohesive, posture becomes stable, and confidence becomes quiet and durable. The self no longer relies on external reassurance because it has internal confirmation. Elevating appearance is not about impressing others. It is about aligning the visible self with the inner one, allowing both to support each other in a continuous feedback loop of strength and presence. Self-respect practiced daily is not an abstract attitude. It is a lived discipline that quietly reshapes how life responds to you. The psyche and the world are in constant dialogue, and self-respect becomes the language through which that dialogue is conducted. What you tolerate, how you care for yourself, and the standards you uphold communicate expectations long before words are spoken. Life answers not to what you desire, but to what you consistently demonstrate you will accept. Daily self-respect begins with small, embodied choices. It is reflected in how you speak to yourself, how you manage your time, how you maintain your body, and how you enforce boundaries. These acts may seem insignificant in isolation, yet the unconscious interprets them collectively as a statement of value. Repetition transforms behavior into identity. When respect becomes habitual, the psyche reorganizes around the assumption that the self is worth protecting. This internal shift alters perception. Situations that once felt tolerable begin to feel misaligned. Opportunities that match one's standards become more noticeable. The individual is no longer driven by scarcity or fear of loss, but by coherence. Clarity influences decision-making. Choices become cleaner because they are guided by alignment rather than approval. The self stops negotiating its worth in exchange for comfort. Life responds to this change because human systems are responsive to signals. When someone consistently honors themselves, they project reliability and clarity. Others instinctively adjust their behavior. Disrespectful dynamics lose traction because they are no longer reinforced. Healthier interactions emerge not through confrontation, but through absence of tolerance for what diminishes the self. The external world recalibrates around the standards being embodied. Self-respect also stabilizes emotional regulation. When the self is treated with consistency, the nervous system settles. Anxiety decreases because internal boundaries reduce unpredictability. The psyche no longer needs to remain hypervigilant, scanning for threats to worth. This calm presence influences how challenges are met. Difficulties are faced with steadiness rather than collapse, signaling to life that the individual is capable of engagement rather than avoidance. There is a compounding effect to this practice. Each act of self-respect builds upon the last, creating momentum. Confidence emerges not as assertion, but as consequence. The individual begins to trust themselves because their actions repeatedly confirm reliability. This trust changes posture, tone, and timing. Opportunities often appear not because the world suddenly changes, but because the individual is now prepared to recognize and receive them. Importantly, self-respect also involves refusal. It requires saying no to what erodes integrity, even when compliance would be easier. These refusals reshape life by closing paths that lead to depletion. What remains is not emptiness, but space. In that space, aligned experiences can enter. The psyche learns that protection is possible without isolation. Over time, the relationship with life becomes reciprocal rather than adversarial. The individual no longer feels pushed around by circumstance, nor do they attempt to dominate it. Instead, they meet life from a position of grounded presence. Self-respect becomes a stabilizing force that influences outcomes indirectly, through consistency rather than control. Life responds differently because the self is no longer asking for value, but demonstrating it daily. So let this be the quiet decision that changes everything. Not a dramatic vow, not a sudden transformation, but a steady commitment to treat yourself as someone who matters. Each day you choose self-respect, you send a clear signal to your inner world and to life itself. I am present, I am responsible, and I am worthy of care. Over time, this consistency reshapes your identity, your relationships, and the opportunities that find you. Life does not respond to who you wish to be, but to who you practice being. When self-respect becomes your daily language, the world answers in kind.